Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Welcome to our webinar on continuity of operations planning for congregations and faith-based nonprofits. My name is Peter Gudaitis, and I'm the Executive Director of New York Disaster Interfaith Services. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Dr. Lucy Cummings, who's our Senior Program Manager for Faith Sector Resilience. And our Associate Director is also on, Katarina Menrich. We are, one more person joining. This is a course that we've been teaching for a few years now in this format to help congregations in particular plan for what it's called continuity of operations, but for better or for worse, it means how to keep your doors open and keep functioning as an organization in a crisis when certain keystones of functionality fall out of place. So if there's a loss of leadership, for instance, perhaps a senior pastor becomes ill or incapacitated in some way, or a board president, or the head of a church school, or the finance office. How do you keep functioning as an organization when different challenges arise? And it could be because of a crisis like a disaster, but it could also simply be about human change within organizations, as well as infrastructure challenges like loss of power or a fire. While big, terrible, catastrophic things happen, and we certainly should be prepared for those things, which is called all hazards planning, any type of hazard, most of the emergencies that we're talking about are the day-to-day crises that happen in any community at any time. There can always be a power outage, there can always be a fire, there can always be a death or an illness in leadership. And how do we plan to keep congregations open? So there's a lot of disturbing research about how many organizations fail in times of crisis when they are not prepared with a plan. In businesses, it's around 1 in 7. So small businesses, because they don't have appropriate insurance or they don't have redundant leadership, nobody to open the doors, nobody to order the food, kind of thing. So you're going to hear reiterated throughout our time together today how important it is to not only have backup, but backup for your backup. So we use the irreverent term 3 deep. So for every essential function of your congregation or your organization, do you have a plan and a backup plan for every essential function? So not just a treasurer, but a backup treasurer and a backup treasurer, so that when something happens, you can always write a check. If you have a senior faith leader that leads worship, who's your backup? And then who's the backup for that backup? Part of it is just the natural course of things. Not everybody's always available when you need them. They could be on vacation themselves. They could be unavailable that day. But part of it is in times of crisis, everybody's in crisis. And a lot of institutions wrongly assume that the senior pastor is never in crisis and they're always perfectly good health and they're always going to be able to lead everything. But the reality is that anybody in senior leadership is also affected by whatever the crisis of the moment is. And they may need to be with their family or they may need to evacuate. So I'm going to share this screen, but just a few housekeeping issues. if you need to step away for a few minutes, feel free to shut off your camera and come back and join us. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we're a relatively small group, so you can certainly just simply interrupt and ask your question at what feels like an appropriate time to ask. If you are the only person talking and nobody's ever talking, maybe you're talking more than you should and other people need a turn. If you don't want to take notes, which is fine, we are recording this webinar and we will be posting it on Nidus's YouTube channel, so you could review it later if you chose to, or share it with other people in leadership. So when we use the term also throughout the time together today, leadership, we're talking about ordained religious leaders as well as lay people in leadership roles. So religious leaders, by definition, are those that lead faith communities, and there are lay people in those roles, and there are ordained people or certified, credentialed, appointed faith leaders as well. So when I say religious leader, you can assume I'm talking about both ordained leaders and lay leaders, unless I specifically say clergy. Okay. So again, the technical term for what we're talking about today, the emergency management parlance, if you will, is continuity of operations planning, often just referred to as COOP, the acronym for continuity of operations planning. So we're going to introduce yourselves in a minute, but we're going to have 3 principal modules. One is talking about essential functions, order of succession, and the delegation of authority. So what are, for your specific congregation or nonprofit, what are the essential functions of your organization? If you're a food pantry, your essential function is feeding people. But in order to feed people, there are other essential functions. You have to be able to order food. You have to be able to store food, prepare food, serve food, all safely. Module 2 is about backup. So the alternative locations, how you communicate with your backup plan, if you will, and how do you also make sure you are maintaining records which are essential to your operations. It's great that you have money in the bank, but if you can't cut a check, your money doesn't do you much good. And then the third are other considerations related to keeping your plan functional. So human resource considerations, how we test the plans, train for the plan, exercise the plan, and how, when something goes wrong, how quickly we can reconstitute, how quickly we can get a congregation or an organization functioning. Not necessarily fully functioning, not perfectly functioning, but functioning enough to get your essential functions back online. We're going to talk a little bit about next steps, and which would mean writing a plan. And there is going to be an evaluation to complete, and if you complete that evaluation, which we hope you will, we will send you a copy of the PowerPoint slide deck in addition to the recording that will be publicly available. Okay, so let's talk about continuity of operations a little bit beyond what I just discussed, and how we can apply the concepts, or the best practices, if you will, of COOP. And we're going to do a little tabletop exercising of that planning. Tabletop exercise is basically a talking exercise rather than physically acting out a drill, if you will. And we're going to talk about how you can begin writing a COOP framework or plan for your congregation or nonprofit. Okay, so I am going to read people's names out in the order they appear on my screen. So hopefully we won't rotate faces too much. But I'm going to start with Race Hodges.
Hi, thank you, Peter. There's my camera. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Race Hodges. I am the faith-based coordinator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Region 2 here based in New York City. And I am really excited and looking forward to this training today, and I'm thankful to have been invited. My mission here at FEMA is to conduct outreach to faith-based communities, houses of worship, congregations to support their emergency and disaster preparedness needs. So I'm looking forward to learning today and meeting some of the other attendees on the meeting. And thank you for having me.
Thanks, Race. And if you'd like to put your email in the chat, folks will know how to contact you if they have any questions for FEMA. Next, Corey Chisholm.
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Corey Anthony Chisholm. I am from the Seventh Adventist Medical Cadet Corps. I work as the Deputy Chief Training Officer for the Corps within the Northeastern Conference. So we spread across FEMA Region 2 and 3. So from New York straight to Maine, we have churches in all of those areas, and we do have medical cadets throughout those states as well.
Thank you. Jenny?
Hi there. I'm Ginny Perrin. I am the Chief Operations Officer at the Mary McDowell Friends School, which is a Quaker school for children with learning disabilities in Brooklyn. I know that I'm a school, that I'm part of a school, but as part of the Quaker community, we work together with other Quaker schools, and we are experiencing between Hurricane Ida in the fall, and then we just had an active shooter threat to our school. And we wanted to look at our continuity plan. We're also, our head of school of 30 years will be leaving. So it hits so many different pieces, and what we looked at as a continuity plan and what I think we really need to do are very different. And the documents that you shared so far, I'm really excited to be part of this and make modifications for our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Agatha.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Agatha Irish. I'm from, like Corey, I'm a medical cadet corps. I'm one of the captains within the Bronx, Manhattan area, and I'm happy to be here so I can learn more and get more information to share with my team.
Thank you. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Uliskar?
I'm calling you.
Hi, I'm Uliska Peter Laville. Like Corey and Agatha, I'm from the Seventh-day Adventist Medical Cadet Corps. I'm a lieutenant over there, and I'm happy to be here so that we can bring back information and to help our community at large.
Thank you. And finally, Wendy.
I'm outside, so I'm going to have to make it brief. Wendy Kelly Carter, how are you?
Thank you. And your congregation or organization, Wendy?
Repeat that again.
What's your congregation or organization?
Greater Universal Baptist Church, Bronx, New York.
Okay, thank you so much. And then my staff colleagues, Dr. Lucy Cummings.
Hi, my name is Lucy Cummings, and as Peter mentioned, I'm the Senior Manager for Faith Sector Resilience, and I work with our faith communities from all backgrounds to help them be prepared.
and Katerina. You're muted.
Hi everyone, I'm Katerina. I'm New York Disaster Interfaith Services Assistant Director. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about COOP. As I mentioned, this acronym stands for Continuity of Operations Planning, and it is planning done to continue to conduct the day-to-day administrative religious functions, programs, and services, as well as support for the public or tenant programs within your facilities during any type of incident or event. And in an emergency management, we refer to all hazards. So knowing what you know about where your institution, where your facilities are, what are the most likely threats, and what are threats that are unlikely or potentially impossible. Although that's a big word in disaster in the disaster world. So for instance, here in New York City, earthquakes are extremely unlikely. We're not in what's called the Ring of Fire, where there's a lot of seismic activity. We can have earthquakes. There's actually a fault line that runs across 125th Street here in Manhattan, but it's a relatively inactive fault line. And there hasn't been a catastrophic quake along that fault line in hundreds of years. An active shooter, as Ginny mentioned. Unfortunately, this is an increasing hazard in this country, particularly with the rise of hate-related groups, white nationalist, right-wing, domestic terrorism. These can be groups that are well known to us, like the Ku Klux Klan or Aryan Brotherhood, and they can also be what are called lone wolf incidents. One individual who has a social grievance or is potentially mentally ill. They can also be retribution crimes. There have been shootings in congregations and schools because domestic abusers know that that's where the person who they want to attack will be. Or they blame a faith leader or a member of their family for something and they know they'll be in that facility. Fires and natural hazards like flooding are perhaps the most common hazards. We just saw that in an extreme way in Ida, but we're also, as you are all more than well aware, well into 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still affecting our day-to-day operations and people's lives. There's also emerging threats, which is why anyone who writes and is responsible for a continuity of operations plan should also monitor emerging threats. There was news earlier this week that there's a new, more virulent strain of HIV that's been identified in the Netherlands. HIV, as you all know, decimated the gay male community in the United States in the early 80s, but it grew from there to primarily today being a virus that is passed both in the gay community and in the heterosexual community, IV drug users, and it still presents a hazard even though it is a manageable disease and no longer a death sentence like it was 20 or 30 years ago. So evolving threats are something we want to make sure someone is responsible for monitoring within any institution. So these are the 3 tiers of planning that we want to focus on. Pre-emergency assessment, which is, of course, includes monitoring. So, but in that assessment, what is your congregation's mission? What's your primary responsibility? For a church, it's educate. For a worship and or social services. For a nonprofit, it could be education. It could be feeding. It could be medical care. What will your congregation or organization do in an emergency? Do you stay on mission, or do you shift? Or more frequently in emergency management called pivoting. And who will assess for unmet needs as the circumstances change and a population is potentially victimized by a crisis? How are you going to identify the gaps that exist in that population to meet those needs? For instance, if you were running a school during the pandemic, all of a sudden you had to be concerned about PPE, extra layers of cleaning, clear communication, health monitoring, working with the health department, reporting illnesses, requiring testing. All of those things are pivoting to address unmet needs that are not normally addressed in what we call blue sky time. Blue sky time is normal, everyday, day-to-day life, even with its tragedies. Gray sky time is when things start getting challenging because of an emerging threat or because of a specific hazard. From pre-assessment, we move into emergency planning because now we know what we're planning for. Will that change post-incident? If you're a school, you can't really stop being a school. Kids are required to go to school a certain number of days every year to be a legitimate school. If you're a feeding program, the need for food increases during times of crisis. It doesn't decrease. If you're a medical provider organization, the need increases during times of crisis. It doesn't decrease. So if you're a feeding program or a medical program and an emergency happens, demand goes up for what you offer. And the American people are a deeply religious people. In the United States, approximately 70% of our population identifies with a specific faith tradition. And when tragedy happens in their lives, they are more likely to seek out the support of a faith leader, attend worship, pray, and ask for support than they are during blue sky time. Who must be or should be involved in emergency planning? Your senior leader, whoever that is, could be your pastor, could be executive director, principal, has no choice but to be involved in emergency planning. This is not something you can delegate away from senior leadership. It doesn't mean they have to write the plan, but they have to be involved. So does anybody involved with security or finance or ordering food and supplies or medical supplies. There are certain stakeholders in the planning process that have no choice. And there are others that have a choice because they might have expertise or simply an interest, or perhaps they were appointed or elected. And when will programs and response take place and for how long? Some of us can't pivot quickly. It's going to take a few days. Others can pivot immediately and get volunteers in the field quickly and begin to help at a moment's notice. And then once we have the pre-assessment and the planning done, what are we doing during emergencies and after? What are our assets? What are our capabilities? You could add into that, what are our responsibilities? And who you must and should be networked with. As a medical organization like Corey's Adventist Medical Corps, you must be networked with public health. You must be networked with a supply chain. You must be networked with volunteers. You must be networked with your local health department. These are all necessary to function in the medical space versus the education space versus the congregation space. And where will our activities take place? It's great that you have a school, but what happens if the school has a fire? What's the backup plan? It's great that you have a beautiful sanctuary, beautiful church, but what happens when there's no electricity or no heat, a water leak, the organ doesn't work, something like that. So COOP addresses these disruptions in how our congregations or nonprofits function. We have to ensure continued performance of these essential functions and potentially a surge in demand for those essential functions. Ensuring succession to office of key people. Like I said, it's great to run a school, but nobody's going to stay around for very long if they don't get paid. Nobody's going to deliver food if they're not getting paid. So how do we keep leadership in place and functioning and feeling supported and cared for? Because the other side of it is alienation and burnout. Providing assistance to congregants, staff, and clients, right? We have different constituencies in the various institutions that are represented here. Members of the worshiping community, staff of the worshiping community, clients or congregants are varying here, right? The clients can be the public, the clients can be students, the clients could be patients. Reducing and mitigating disruption of ritual life, communal life, social outreach, social services. We know from studying the psychology of trauma, disruptions to religious ritual life, communal life, family life have a traumatizing effect on individuals, particularly young children and the elderly. People who require the care of others to navigate crisis. That doesn't mean, however, the normally fully functioning and healthy middle-aged professional isn't going to be traumatized. They can be too. It's just different because the others require more specialized care. And also, how do we reduce disruption to social outreach and social services, particularly as demand increases? Protecting essential assets. How do we protect things of temporal and spiritual value? Sacred texts, perhaps. Office equipment, computers that store records, manuals, documents, all the things that you need to continue to function as an organization. And can we achieve this in a timely way? Can we recover and or rebuild as necessary? So the main focus of a COOP framework focuses in these three areas for faith communities: administration and operations, religious life, and communal programs and services. Some of these things may be paying tenants, And some of these things may be wholly owned ministries, if you will, of a congregation or a faith-based nonprofit. So for instance, Nidus has an affiliate nonprofit that we provide oversight for called the Emergency Shelter Network. These are emergency respite bed shelters in congregations. So we have to be concerned about our own operations, but also the operations of our affiliate. When creating a COOP framework, consider who needs to be involved, and we just talked about that a little bit: clergy, lay people, lay leadership, secretaries, clergy assistants, custodians, security, teachers, cooks. Really depends on what your essential functions are. And when we sit down to write that plan, this is probably the most important slide for content. These 3 modules and these 9 areas: essential functions, order of succession, delegation of authority, alternate location or facilities, communications, or emergency communications here, essential function, essential record keeping, human resources, TTE, test training and exercising, and reconstitution. I'll just to throw a question out there. If you need to evacuate your office quickly, and you know you can't take all your file cabinets with you, where are most people's records today? On what?
Their computer.
Your computer. So if you have to evacuate quickly, do you need to take the keyboard and the monitor and the computer with you? The CPU? You don't. You only need to grab the CPU, right? The thing with the memory on it. Because you can hook that computer up to any monitor and any keyboard and get back into it. So don't overplan either, right? It's not really possible for someone to carry a keyboard, a monitor, and a CPU out in a hurry. As a matter of fact, it's kind of dangerous. They could drop it and hurt themselves. It's not necessary. The only thing you need to grab is the computer. However, if you've been planning well, you have a backup of that computer, and hopefully it's in the cloud or on some sort of portable drive. And what you don't really have to take anything because you've got that backup drive somewhere else, or you can access your data remotely. So there's different levels of continuity of operations planning, and some of it's expensive and some of us can't afford that. But there are inexpensive ways to back up, if you will, our records and our essential functions so that we can get up and running again. You don't need a checkbook today, but you do need to be signed up for electronic banking if you don't have the opportunity to bring your checkbook. Or credit cards. A lot of nonprofits hate credit cards because they're areas for fraud. You can do a lot with a credit card, like an Amex card, because it has unlimited spending on it. So these are the kinds of things you should think about in addition to the reasons why people don't like doing those things. And upgrading computers today means you don't need a 20-pound CPU anymore. You can get a small desktop CPU that's about the size of an old 1980s Walkman. So let's talk about considerations for writing a plan. Do you think you need a plan for your organization? Yeah? I would simply say this: everybody needs a plan. Every family needs a plan, every congregation needs a plan, and every nonprofit needs a plan. And we're getting closer and closer to the day where those plans are either mandated by denominations or institutional leadership, or by insurance companies, insurance carriers, or the Department of Education, or a foundation that funds you. We're getting further and further down the road where they're no longer optional, but they are essential. Again, what are your most likely risks? This is something you really have to think through. Here in New York, particularly here in New York City, we're extremely vulnerable to hurricanes as a natural hazard. We're also extremely vulnerable to terrorism. And I think we can all agree we're extremely vulnerable to pandemics, infectious disease. Again, we're not planning for earthquakes is something we should think about, but not something we should spend a lot of time on. It's not a likely hazard. Who are the stakeholders for your institution? That's only a question you can answer for yourself. Who are the essential leaders? In a small congregation, it might be the pastor and the first lady, the pastor's wife. If the pastor's female, the pastor and the first gentleman. It could be the head of your congregational council. It could be your executive director and the chair of your board. The head of the school. Who can you get involved with, and who can take the lead? And a leader doesn't necessarily need to have personal expertise, but a leader needs to know where to get that expertise. How do you apply corrective actions in your ministry? So this is a whole new lens on how we evaluate the effectiveness of leadership and of institutional governance. So doing business as normal does not mean a congregation is prepared for a crisis. If you think about what would happen to your congregation or your nonprofit if your senior pastor or your executive director and the chair of your parish council or your board of directors were both in a car accident together and badly hurt and wouldn't be able to come to work for 6 months, what would that mean for your congregation? That's not even death, right? That's just mostly out of commission. And how do you apply corrective actions for your COOP plan? Sorry for the double your there. We need to correct that typo. Corrective action is complicated. It's easy to make a decision. The question is, will your institution back that decision up? Have you been appointed to make that decision? Will you be respected for that decision? And will people follow that decision? And does everybody else know what the plan is? If the plan in my family is that I evacuate the dog, right? That's my job. And I'm not home. Who evacuates the dog next? And if that person's not home, but there's only 2 of us that live at home, what's the corrective action? Find somebody else to know that there's a dog in the house when something bad goes wrong. So it doesn't mean there have to be 3 people living in the house, but there's got to be a plan behind the plan. And I can't question the plan either. So you'll notice, for anybody, particularly any of you that have served in the military or any hierarchical organization, I noticed someone said that they're a lieutenant, Uliskar, I think. You can't have people during an emergency saying, I don't really want to follow your leadership. That gets people killed, right? It's dangerous for people to question the authority structure within an institution when people's lives are at risk. Okay, so let's talk about essential functions. The essential functions are the activities and services performed by a congregation or faith-based organization that are critical to its mission, and those things that contribute to life safety. So, is signage an essential function? Yeah, right? Signs, knowing where the exits are, is an essential function. Fire extinguishers are an essential function. Alarm systems are essential functions. Shut-off valves for the gas are essential functions. So your mission's essential, but there are life safety functions that take place within your facility that need to be on someone's mind in an emergency. If the police show up or the fire department shows up on your property, knowing where the gas shutoff valve is essential. As a former youth minister, this used to give me anxiety. If there's an active shooter in a congregation, when there's children in the facility, let's just say a youth group meeting, do parents know not to descend on the congregation and to meet somewhere else because it's dangerous for them to come? But they will come, even though they're told not to, unless they've experienced an exercise where they know it works. If they go someplace else, they're going to get communication there. Most people, when they're in protective mode, don't really care what the rules are. They just want to get to whoever the person is that they're supposed to protect, their spouse, their children. But it is dangerous for everyone involved if a parent shows up trying to get into a school or a church where there's an active shooter. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, let's talk offline. Because each congregation or organization has their own unique mission, essential functions vary. And when you're writing your COOP plan, consider how you prioritize those essential functions. We just saw this with COVID. Is it essential that we meet for public worship? No, it's not. It's essential to have worship, but it's not essential to meet in person. It's preferred. It's the way congregations know. We enjoy it more, but it's not necessary. Spiritual care is necessary. How do we provide spiritual care in a time of crisis? And do people feel cared for when they know a plan will accommodate their needs in an emergency? The answer is emphatically yes. Social services. What social services are essential? It would seem obvious that feeding is essential, but let's look more broadly. During a crisis, like a hurricane, where buildings are destroyed and power's out for weeks, is it essential for someone to get to 12-step programs if they have an addiction? Yeah, because it is very common after a traumatic event for people who do have substance use challenges to slip. So life-saving functions of social services matter, but sometimes the therapeutic and treatment side, the health maintenance side of things, is equally important to those who are struggling with addiction or abuse, substance use. Ritual life. Returning to ritual life is essential for mental health and spiritual health, but how we do that can be navigated in unique ways within different communities. These are some examples, right? Ritual services, religious education, social service programs, and social service. Supportive activities, right, that support those functions, the management of the facility, the maintaining of records, communication, and how we get people connected to services. So I want to talk a little bit about communication. Within COOP, there is an emergency communication function that also has its own acronym. It's called CIRC, Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication. The fancy terminology doesn't matter. What matters is the function. You must be able to communicate with people in an emergency. Phone trees are not an efficient way of communicating in this day and age. We don't have what are called POTS lines anymore, copper wire telephone service. POTS stood for plain old telephone service. So POTS lines back in the day were copper wire telephone service. Phones worked even when the power didn't. Today, most people have digital phones that require being plugged in, or they have cell phones. For instance, in my house, we don't have any hardwired phones. We just have cell phones. Cell phones run out of batteries. Cell phones can be charged on car batteries or by solar power or by a generator. So if you want to communicate in an emergency as a congregation, you need to be able to communicate in one of those three ways. Through cell phones, on a computer, via the internet, but you need power for that. Or people need to know how to contact you, right, in person. In general, essential functions are something you have to get up within 12 hours. It could be a shorter period of time, depending on what you do, right? If there's a fire in your house of worship at midnight and you have services at 8 a.m., your window has narrowed. If you're running a school and there's a fire at 10 a.m. the night before and kids are supposed to be in the building at 8 a.m., you have a shorter window to communicate. Do you have a backup plan, however, for those essential functions? And a backup plan isn't just something on paper. A backup plan sometimes requires a written plan and a written agreement with another organization, another institution. If I have a fire in my house of worship and we can't worship, will you let us worship in your space? If I lose my power in my food pantry and at any given time I've got $10,000 worth of turkeys in the fridge, how do I get a generator or how do I move that food? Order of succession. We talked about this already. 3 deep. Number 1 person in authority in blue sky time, and their backup, and their backup's backup. And do people know what that plan is? Does anybody remember a time in the United States where there was a failure of leadership at the executive level? You got to have been at least in high school in the 1980s. Does anybody remember when Ronald Reagan got shot? What happened? There was an argument about who was in charge when the president was incapacitated, even though the Constitution clearly lays it out. Al Haig, the Secretary of Defense, was at the White House and claimed he was in charge. Legally, he wasn't. Constitutionally, he wasn't. But when you get on TV and tell people you're in charge, what does that do? did that calm people down, or did it raise anxiety and did it cause confusion? It raised anxiety. I mean, he got roasted for the rest of his life about it. Thankfully, it didn't do any harm. A plan and an order of succession are important because they create a backup plan for identified leadership. And notice that word identified. It's not a secret. It won't work if it's a secret. And this isn't about, well, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings, so we'll just keep it to ourselves. The problem is everybody will question that decision unless they know that decision's already made. Ensure that there's an orderly transition of leadership. If the senior pastor, if the senior pastor in a congregation has said, when I'm not available, it's this person is my number 2, and when that person's not available, this person is their number 2, there's no confusion. If something happens to me at Nidus, I get hit by a car one morning, Katerina is the associate director, that's fine and dandy. But if Lucy challenges her authority, it will sow chaos amongst the rest of the staff. In some cases, succession is prescribed by statute or order or directive, right? In many faith communities, it's already prescribed, but nevertheless, it should be in writing and it should be clear to everybody. These are examples of organizational charts, and I recommend using organizational charts to help explain lines of authority. A mosque in this structure makes it very clear that in a mosque, the board of trustees is actually the top dog, if you will. In a synagogue, potentially as well. The imam or the rabbi serve at the pleasure, if you will, of the board. True for most nonprofits too. In a Roman Catholic church, the priest is the ultimate authority. The congregational council or elders have some temporal power, but ultimately the priest is the decider in chief, if you will. So within your parish, within your church, within your nonprofit, what's your line of authority? And how is it delegated? These are the 4 ways that authority is delegated. It's assigned to someone, prescribed, if you will, it's written. And then that authority is transferred by either standard operating procedure or by a written transfer of power. Stage 3 is the tricky one, acceptance. Does everyone know that plan, and will they accept that delegation of authority, that transfer of authority? Or will there be a fight about it, if you will? And is there accountability with that delegation of authority? If I am incapacitated and Katerina assumes leadership at Nidus, because that's the agreement, will the rest of the staff accept it? And if they don't accept it, what's the accountability? Does Katerina have the right to dismiss the entire staff that I've hired? Can she start spending money any way she wants? Can she not communicate with the chair of the board of directors? The answer to that is no. There are limits to the transfer of power and what the succeeding leaders have the ability to do. Spending money, opening new bank accounts, firing people are typically not in their purview. So in that delegation of authority, we need to be clear what authority is being delegated. Katerina is not the new executive director. She's the acting executive director. So her authority is limited. Explicitly outline the authority, delineate limits and accountability, and define the circumstances under which delegation takes place. Delegation does not always take place because something happens where everybody gets to make a decision. There were 140 or something clergy in New York City that died from COVID. Most of those clergy were probably in congregations where they were the only clergy person. So if they were out for a few days sick and all of a sudden they were told that person is now in the hospital, and if you remember at the height of the pandemic, you couldn't go visit anybody. You couldn't even necessarily get them on the phone. It's not clear sometimes if the delegation has taken place. It's not even clear if the person will ever come back. We've had clergy in New York City drop dead, right? From a heart attack, stroke, sometimes in front of the congregation. How is that authority delegated in that circumstance, and for how long? Okay. So let's talk through some of these functions and using the worksheets that we have. So normally we would be doing this in purpose, so we in person, so we can't really do it in small groups. So we're going to do it together here on the computer, so you can unmute yourself and talk if you'd like. So apply the concepts of essential functions, orders of succession, and delegation as they really relate to the administration and operations, the ritual life, and the community services programs in your congregation or organization. And then let's figure that out, right? So this is a worksheet that you were emailed to help you figure out what the essential functions are, but that requires listing all functions first. You can start in any order, but it's also sometimes helpful to use that organizational chart structure that I showed you earlier when you're filling this out for your own congregation. So either in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and say it out loud. What are some of the essential functions in your organization? And we give you a freebie here with payroll, because none of us, I can be relatively certain none of us want to ever go without a paycheck. So what are the essential functions that other essential functions you can think of? I can call on folks, or you can just sort of throw your hat in the race.
I think for us, it's interesting that you put payroll. We won't call it payroll, but we have someone who functions in terms of administering any or financial transactions. For example, if we get donations or funds that are coming in, that there is a person who is looking at after. And if we do need to spend money, we're a very volunteer organization. If we do spend money, it's in money that we have collected for that particular, but there is a person we will call that person functions as like a logistics person for us.
Okay.
In that, so for us, we have one person. We also have a safety officer assigned, someone who is assigned not only for internal safety but also external safety, especially if we're doing an operation.
That's a great example, right? So security or safety is an essential function.
Yeah, we also have someone, we call them, we use the same FEMA terminologies, so public information officer,
Right.
and sometimes you also have a liaison officer if there are other entities that we have to communicate with, or if even though it's within the Adventist church, there's another department that we're working with. In essentially like Adventist Community Services, we will have, or another conference outside of the Northeastern Conference, the liaison person is the one that would essentially, so everybody knows if I need to communicate or get information from, let's say, um, Peter, who is, from the Methodist congregation, just using you as an example, Peter, we know that the liaison person is the one who is filtering and funneling that and responsible for that. And we're not all funneling information or communicating to Peter, and he's like, I don't know what to do, who is where. So we have those key functions. I mean, at the top end, we do have someone who is in charge, and that person normally have an assistant. We also have those roles very assigned. On the previous conversation you were having, I was just reflecting on how we operate, because everything for us is we kind of have a military style of doing things. So, for example, I'm a captain. Lieutenant Irish is a lieutenant. Everybody already knows that I am the captain, so I outrank her in some case. But when it comes to example, if we're doing outreach and it's medically inclined, an emergency that is medically inclined, we then know the powers shift a little bit, and the chief person is the most qualified or senior medical person on scene or in the area. That is the person. All the titles are, duty to her. And even as the captain, even though that person might be a lower rank, I know that person is a medical officer. This is a medical response. That is the person who's in charge for
Okay.
this particular operation. So yeah.
Thank you. Others, essential functions that you can think about for your congregation or organization.
Joan listed logistics in the chat, Peter.
I need to open the chat here. Hold on. Logistics, absolutely, right? Particularly if you are purchasing and supplying things to keep your doors open or to serve the public.
So essentially, if I can just talk a little bit what Joan is saying. So logistics, in this sense, we have an overall logistics person. For that, what you're referring to, Peter, under this logistics person, there's a sub person that we call a supplies or a quartermaster that really handles all the purchasing and of any supplies that we need, especially when we're dealing with like not our shelters or warehousing,
Right.
and we need stuff to go there. But yeah.
Thank you. Others? Maybe what if your leadership structure is based on consensus, right? So within some faith communities, there's no individual leader, right? Choice decisions are made by consensus, particularly in Anabaptist congregations like the Amish and Mennonites. Everybody has to agree before a decision made. That's hard in an emergency to function that way, but some communities do choose to function that way. Hopefully in an emergency, the plan would include a few people they'd be willing to allow to make decisions, and to get to reconvene the group as a whole as soon as possible. What are some functions that fall under worship or community service and programs? Is worship an essential function of congregations? Don't get all shy on me now.
Yes.
I wish that. Oh yeah, it is. I feel like now I'm talking too much. So Chaplain Irish, who's on this phone, should really speak up on the call because is the one that will function. So under worship, we have chaplains, and they fill that function for us in particular. But yes, it is a
Okay.
function.
I think we, as faith communities, we should be careful never to undervalue the role that spiritual health and spiritual care play in human resilience. For someone who is religious, someone who's a person of faith, they are looking for a connection to pastoral care or the ability to center themselves in accordance with their own spiritual practices as soon as possible after a traumatic event. And that doesn't just go for adults. Children find comfort in ritual. They may not be theologically sophisticated, but they know the practice of going to church with mom and dad or their grandma or their auntie is something that they can rely on. So even if it's just the ritual act, it is something that brings comfort and stability to children. Sophistication, deep theological evaluation, that's not really what we're after here. We're after the life cycle of events that happen in relationship to congregational life that make people feel connected to community and hope. One of the greatest challenges of adversity is maintaining hopefulness. When people lose hope, they begin to spiral. They become ungrounded. They make decisions based on emotions rather than building consensus and seeking support and talking things through. So it is so important, when possible, to bring some ritual worship and prayer life back to people who live in communities of faith. And the other thing I will say is, this is also the time in American life where people who have fallen away from their congregations sometimes return. Chaplaincy, as Corey was pointing out, is one of the expressions of pastoral care, disaster spiritual care in this context, that is made available through congregations and religious organizations. Good spiritual care also includes mental health assessment and referral. It's sometimes called psychological first aid. Sometimes people understand it as mental health first aid, but it is the role of spiritual caregivers to also know where the limits of their abilities end and the need for a professional mental health provider begins. Someone who is suicidal, someone who is schizophrenic or suffers from clinical depression may find comfort in speaking with a chaplain, but also needs the care of a mental health professional. Okay, what about community service? What are some essential services, if you will, and the function of people under those essential services? So what are some essential services that exist in your congregations? Does anybody operate social outreach programs or social service programs? Maybe not in this group, but I'm just asking. Okay. So
Sorry, we do food kitchens and things like that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Jenny?
We do food kitchens.
Okay, so feeding ministries, right? Food pantries, soup kitchens, homeless feeding, so canteening is it's often called, right? Where you bring food out into the street, serve a hot meal or hand out cold meals. These are essential functions. So who within your congregations, your organizations, is responsible for running that operation day to day, and how do we back that person up, if you will, and potentially how do we fund it, because that's the other challenge in a disaster. Money gets diverted. This is something that can get expressed in rather extreme ways. So, for instance, many congregations in New Orleans failed after Hurricane Katrina because the congregation evacuated. So there was no way of getting, if you will, a plate offering from a congregation that was now living in Baton Rouge, Atlanta, Houston, and scattered to the four corners of the Gulf states. So when you can't collect the plate offering, today we have more options with online donations and things like that than we had in 2005. But how long can you keep your doors open as an organization if you can't fundraise, or if you can't collect stewardship income, or if you can't get tuition checks? The answer for most nonprofits is not very long. Most nonprofits usually at the most carry 2 to 3 months of cash, and without additional payments or additional stewardship income, they can't make their financial obligations. So planning for revenue is an essential function. Not just paying people, but getting the money to pay people, getting the money to buy the food, getting the money to purchase travel, cover logistics costs, that sort of thing as well. Providing sustainable clothing, hot meals, shower vans. I love these ideas, right? If we're providing those kinds of services, normally people expect them from us, but in a disaster, people are going to need those things, potentially, depending on the type of disaster. Shower trailers, shower vans are very hard to come by in a disaster. There are many in the United States, but there's never enough. So after Hurricane Sandy, for instance, NIDIS worked with the United Way to put temporary showers in congregations in beachfront communities.
Just for Peter, we have an ongoing, actually, we call it Showers of Blessings. Not only in disasters, but we also do it just during the year as well for some of our homeless populations here in the city. A part of our Adventist Community Services outreach.
That's a great ministry, and I think I'm not sure we would call it an essential function, but it's certainly a component of mission, which is the things that we need to do need to restore human dignity. And that means clean clothes, a safe place to eat, treated with respect, being given food, not only food to sustain you, but food that you actually like, food that's culturally appropriate, and the food that you'll actually eat. Recognizing people who are vegetarians or who don't drink coffee or have halal meals, all of these things are about cultural and religious competency as much as they are about human dignity. Nobody wants to be treated in a way that feels like, it's difficult for you to help them, if you will, right? They want to feel that this is something you're doing because you want to do it and you're helping them. I often would say when I'm deployed, I often feel like they help me more than I help them, kind of thing, because there's an enormous reward in helping people in crisis and the appreciation that they share back. Okay, so let's look at another worksheet. This is how we map out essential functions and assign them out, right? So the example of payroll being an essential function, ensure that all clergy and staff are paid is the purpose of that function. It's under the category of administration and operations. And then there is the primary person who does this regularly. Business administrator, could be the congregation secretary, could be the CFO. It depends on how your organization's structured. That's not what's really important. But that's that key blue sky time role, right? The key position. The successor, the lead pastor, successor to with limits, financial secretary, bookkeeper, maybe the parish treasurer. And then you have the successor, the third successor, a ministry assistant, if you will. So let's talk about the essential function of communication. Who in your organization, Corey used the term PIO, Public Information Officer. It's an emergency management term for who speaks for the institution. So if an essential function is communication, who in your organization, Jenny, is responsible for communicating?
I think it depends on what the communication is.
Okay, say a little bit more.
If it's a school-wide community communication, it'll come from the head of school.
Okay.
If it is division specific, it'll come from a lower school director or a middle school director or high school, upper school director.
Okay. All right. So let's say, God forbid, there's a fire in the school. School is not usable tomorrow. The essential function is communication. What's the description here?
So that's internal and external.
Yep.
So so it would be that families would have to be notified, students would need to be notified, faculty would need to be notified, and staff would need to be notified, as well as any vendors and service providers would need to be sought out.
Okay, so the essential functions communication, and this description of the critical process is communicating to each stakeholder the information, the essential information that they need to navigate that process, right? That fire. What are we doing tomorrow? As a parent, what do you need to know? What do the students need to know? And what do they not need to know, right? Children don't need to know everything. Children need to know a certain amount of information. Parents not only need to know everything, they probably want to know more than everything, right? Staff need to know everything. And then that category would be administration and operations, right? Because the head of school is administration. The key position you said is head of school. Now, who are the successors? Is there a
Associate head of school? Myself would be back the third. So it's head of school, associate head of school, myself, and then the next one, we don't know. We have to figure that one out.
You got to figure that out. Okay, fair enough. Well done. So that's what we're talking about, right? Looking at every essential function, figuring out at the minimum what that essential function covers, who needs to know, if you will, in the communication category. Who needs to know about a food problem? Who needs to know about an infrastructure problem, a security problem? And then what category is it under? Is it an administrative function or is it a spiritual or religious function, or is it a service function? And then that lineup, right? Who's the day-to-day person responsible, and those three successors.
And it seems to me that what you are bringing up is something that has multiple categories. So there's the operational piece, the administrative piece, but there's also a spiritual follow-up, right? As a community care response.
Right. So, you know, we have a friends shelter in here in Manhattan.
Yep.
The shelter is in this gymnasium of the school, even though it's a ministry of the congregation. So everything that affects the shelter not only affects the church, if you will, the Quaker Meeting House, but it also affects the congregation. So sometimes there's some intersectionality in here across institutions that we also have to think about. Okay, apologies for the very small font, which I can barely read on my huge computer. So this is an organizational chart that helps with those other two worksheets. Who's the ultimate authority within your institution? In most nonprofits, it's the president of the board of directors, and then the chief executive, whoever that is, head of school, executive director. It could be reversed in some congregations where it's actually the senior leader, religious leader, who is the ultimate authority, and then there are other counselor roles underneath. So under this senior leader, you have business administration, program administration, and external affairs, if you will, communication or organization. So again, we can't do this because we're not in person, but take that worksheet, print it out for yourself, and identify all those important functions of your congregation or organization that you perform every day, and then decide which ones are essential. And then what are the requirements for performing these functions? It's kind of a both and, because when you answer the questions of what it requires to perform these functions, some of those requirements make it very hard to pivot quickly. If you've got $10,000 worth of frozen food in your refrigerator, finding another location, moving that food, making sure it stays at a cold temperature, which is required by the health department, how long can it stay in that place? That's very complicated decision making, right? Versus we had a small fire today in one classroom, it didn't affect the rest of the school. Versus the assistant minister is sick today, but the senior minister is fine. So some essential functions are super hard to hurdle, others are easy. And sometimes we have to decide, should we really be doing all of these things in an emergency, or should we give ourselves a break and plot out what do we have to get open within 24 hours, 12 hours, 6 hours, and what can take a week or two or a month? We don't have to do our audit this month. We could do our audit in March. So let's take the pressure off ourselves, not drive everybody crazy, and kick some of these things down the road a bit while we're dealing with the crisis. So identify whether your congregation or nonprofit's functions are essential or not. Essential functions have to be performed during or immediately after an emergency. That's generally how we identify an essential function. And non-essential functions are organizational functions that can be deferred until after the emergency. For instance, the audit. For instance, the playground. For instance, school, right? We can take one day off on Friday, make sure the school is absolutely safe before we let the kids back in, right? So we want to make sure what is a life safety issue, what's about emergency care, and what isn't. And then identify your mission essential functions and essential support activities. So a mission essential function is directly related to accomplishing the congregation or organization's mission. And a support function is something that supports the performance of the mission. A support function is fundraising, right? Communication, secretarial support. Those are all essential support functions, janitorial support. Can't go very long without cleaning certain things, right? So janitors matter quickly in most procedures. This is an example of how we identify essential functions, right? We talked about this previously. Ritual life, such as regular worship services, is a mission essential function for a congregation. Supporting that means everything on this list, but not for all faith communities. Maintaining ritual items, that might just be the Bible in some churches. In a synagogue, it might be the Torah scroll. It could be communion in some congregations. So maintaining the ritual items used for worship. However, just having ritual objects does not provide the service that the community expects. So there are other factors towards ritual life, like the person to perform the rituals. Deferrable mission, providing general religious education, right? It's more important that people are spiritually taken care of than it is that they're receiving religious education. That's something that can wait a few days, maybe even wait a few weeks. But prayer life, ritual life are essential to wellness. And deferrable supporting activities, operating community-based programs that are not contributing to life safety. These are good programs, but are usually not a house of worship's mission. Flea markets, tag sales, festivals, garden club meetings. Some of these things verge on essential, right? Let's just say there's a Boy Scout troop that worships in your congregation. You know, Boy Scout meeting might not be essential, but Boy Scouts are great volunteers that can be mobilized in a time of crisis. So maybe there's a pivot there rather than a complete, we don't need to do this right now. Anything related to food, clothing, medical care, mental health care, those fall into that life safety issue. Okay, we've already done the report out, so we're not going to do that. Let's talk about module 2, alternate locations. This is something that I have to say most congregations and most nonprofits do not plan out properly. Where would you go, physically go, if you couldn't use the space you regularly use for any one of your services? It could be worship, it could be food, could be medical care, could be just the administrative offices, But what's your backup plan? Because of the pandemic, Nidus had to go remote. Our backup plan was to send people home and work from home. We also have a backup plan to relocate our office to White Plains, New York, to the offices of the New York Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. It gets us out of the city, where if the city has to be evacuated, we can't be, to a functioning office space where there's a parking lot and Wi-Fi, the ability to get food, hotels to house staff. So we have a plan for regular work to be done remotely, but we do have to have a physical ability to relocate as well. Yeah.
We have a backup for a local, which is within a block. And then if it's an immediate danger, we have one that's slightly more off-site, but still walkable for the kids. And then we do remote. And we've had to use all of them for different reasons. If it was a local issue, a gas leak, we have to go a little bit further away, but if the water stops working in the building, we can use somebody across the street, you know.
There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect example. Okay, so when you're thinking about alternative sites, these are 3 categories of alternative sites. Hot sites. This is a site where you can immediately, without much effort at all, get fully operational. Power, computers, Wi-Fi, storage, parking, everything you need. It's almost like being at home. A warm site is partially ready for you. So our homes are, in general, hot sites currently, but before the pandemic, they were warm, right? It would take effort to get everybody a computer. Not everybody's Wi-Fi had been double checked. So we've pivoted to a permanent ability to move people home. We've equipped everyone with a laptop. We've checked their Wi-Fi. We use a VPN, virtual link to our server, if you will. A warm site, it takes more effort than that. And a cold site is basically a raw space. It's available, but it's basically just a raw space. It's a place where we can stay warm or air condition in the summer and keep people safe, but we can't function there for very long without a lot of help. If you're running a food pantry, if you've got dry goods, a hot site is a cold site, right? Like if all you have to do is relocate your food and it doesn't need to be refrigerated, you can pivot pretty quickly. But if you've got that $10,000 worth of frozen turkeys, that if they're not refrigerated for more than let's just say 6 hours, they have to be thrown away. Your hot site better include refrigeration, potentially a generator too, because your hot site should have backup. Aspects of a good alternative location should be a sufficient distance from your primary facility. Because if you've got a blackout in your facility and your backup is across the street, it's not the best backup in the world. It's an alternative site, but it's not the ideal one. Primary facilities should also be accessible, but I hope I don't have to say that. And you should maximize the use of existing local religious infrastructure, such as neighboring houses of worship. Like missioned organizations are more likely to be able to support you and appreciate what you do and not resist the way you do things, your standard operating procedure. The best kind of agreement you can get without a lawyer getting involved is an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, not legally binding. When people write crazy, who aren't lawyers, write crazy stuff in the MOUs, better to get a lawyer, right? You cannot protest this. This is a legally binding MOU. There's no such thing as a legally binding MOU. Service level agreements, an SLA, is an internal agreement, not an external agreement, and a contract. This is a legally binding agreement. If you have a hot site backup agreement that if your site goes down, that site will take you in, that is legally binding. If they don't do it exactly as specified in the contract, they have liability. That's always the best way to protect yourself, but most institutions are scared off from contractual arrangements like that. But try to get an MOU. Try to always get an MOU, sometimes called an MOA, memorandum of agreement. Let's talk about communication. Does everybody recognize this antique device? That thing weighed like 2 pounds. You could crack walnuts with it. Versus where we are today. But let's also remember that's generational. My mom is 94 years old. She has a flip phone, cell phone, and she has a landline. I bought her an iPhone 2 years ago during the pandemic so we could FaceTime. She hated it, so we went back to the flip phone. So not everybody communicates the same way. It's different intergenerationally. It's also different based on your economic mobility. You have to have money to buy $1,000 iPhones. You want to make sure that people communicate with the technology that they can navigate for who they are and for what they can afford. So your ability to maintain communications and IT, information technology, and to communicate with congregants during an emergency is essential. A CIRC plan is part of any good COOP plan. So an emergency communication plan is part of any good COOP plan. You need to communicate internally and externally, and sometimes with the public. It's vital to be able to communicate your status quickly. People get anxious when they can't get information. So even if you only have a limited amount of information, it's better to give some information than no information. No information creates an information vacuum, and it makes people spin their wheels. So there's been a fire at the congregation. Have no idea what the extent of the damage is. Say that. We've had a fire. We're devastated by the fire, but we don't know the extent of the damage yet. We're going to keep you posted, and the most important thing, tell people when the next update is coming. People rely on being dependent and trusting you. So share information that's accurate, never exaggerate, get that information out quickly, make sure it was understood, and that it's accessible to every stakeholder that you're trying to reach. Accurate, quick, effective, accessible. This is the 6 principles of emergency communication. Be first, be right, be credible, express empathy, promote action, and show respect. These are the places where we get information, but then we have to communicate it. So one of the biggest challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic has been whether or not the information is credible, because there's a lot of mixed messaging. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated. Get boosted, don't get boosted. Children don't die from COVID. Only elderly people die from COVID. Only health compromised people die from COVID. Every single one of those things I said isn't true. The only thing that matters, that comforts people, is information that is commonly understood as accurate. Most Americans believed that wearing a mask would keep them safe. Nevertheless, there's anti-maskers. Most Americans believe the vaccine is safe. There are others who do not. And some of that is based on misinformation or disinformation, and some of that is based on experience. For instance, in communities of color, vaccine confidence is lower. One of the reasons it's lower is because the United States has a sketchy history with abusing the trust of communities of color when it comes to medical care, and in some cases using Black and brown Americans as guinea pig test subjects in medical experimenting. So is it understandable that some people in communities of color don't trust the federal government's information on the vaccine? It's understandable. That being said, the best information we have from public health is that the vaccine is safe and trustworthy. So asking people to be confident in that is not that easy. There are biases that exist that have to be overcome. So be first, be right, be credible, express empathy, and promote action. People need to know what to do with their anxiety, and they need to be told what to do with their anxiety. Sometimes it's just, I'm going to update you in an hour. That gives people an hour of free headspace to do other things, and they know they're going to get more information in an hour. If you need them to volunteer, if you need them to stay home, tell people what you need from them, and always show respect. I think one of the great tragedies of faith leaders and things they have to say after a disaster is sometimes people blame other people for what's gone wrong. Unfortunately, President Trump chose to do that during the pandemic. The Chinese flu or the Wuhan flu. Unfortunately, that resulted in anti-Asian violence here in the United States, where Asians were beaten and harassed on the street and blamed for spreading the flu. So we have to be very careful with the words we use to make sure they don't excuse bad behavior or try to victimize or villainize other people, because we don't always know everything, and we should always speak with humility and kindness for other people. Essential records. Administrative records, ritual records, so like baptismal records, wedding records, community programs, they exist, right? And they exist in databases and hard copies. And in this day and age, I have to say, in general, the only thing I can really recommend is that people digitize their records. There's no reason why the only copy of something anymore should be a paper copy. Most cheap scanners, photocopiers, printers that you can buy even at Staples, $150. Scan, and those things can be stored electronically. What are the records you need urgently? And then what are the legal and financial rights records that you need short and long term, right? For instance, schools keep medical records on students. Medical records are confidential. Medical records can be abused. They keep HR files, right, on teachers, including disciplinary actions against them, their vacation time off. These kinds of things need to be accessible in an emergency. So again, digitizing them is extremely helpful. Some records we have to keep as an obligation of law, right? Marriage records, birth records, baptismal records. And some we have to keep as a function of business. Who's our insurance company? What are the account numbers? Most of us have multiple types of insurance. Who owns the property? Can we prove it? Right? Where's the deed to the property? Contact information for leadership, congregants, clients, salary information, all that stuff are essential business records. Oop. So let's talk about utility disruption, any one of the kinds of things that can disrupt our life in congregations. Okay. Worksheet number 4, communications. Voice lines, conference lines, data lines. Data lines means internet. Cell phones, email, internet, instant messaging, social media, personal devices, and access and functional need communication, like being able to communicate with the deaf, the hearing impaired. So let's look at the voice line example. Voice line phone, landline phone. The provider's Verizon. They provide phone service, right? That's what this is referring to. This is for the office. The person responsible is the business administrator, an alternate provider, and alternate ways of communicating. This is what I want to focus on here. So here in the NIDIS office, we have 2 different internet providers because we only used to have one. And after Hurricane Sandy, one went down and one didn't. So now we keep both. So we have to pay an extra $100 a month to have backup telephone and internet service. We can't do business if we can't communicate. We can't fundraise if we can't communicate. We can't help people if we can't communicate. If NIDIS's voice over IP phone service goes down, so that's our office phones, do the staff know to switch to their cell phones and that NIDIS will cover that cost? So NIDIS provides $50 a month to every one of our employees so that they will keep our office phone system app on their phone so they can work remotely if they need to. And they can call clients and do work as they need to. The staff appreciate the money. I can be I'm assured of that. but it's just an essential function for us. We have to do it. Our email system operates on the server in our office, but it also operates in the cloud. So you can access Nidus's email even if Nidus's office is burned down. I have to knock on some wood. So this worksheet should guide you through this process of helping to identify what's the backup plan here for any of these communication systems. Communication message template. Every message that you send out should include these 6 emergency message components. Always express empathy. I'm sorry to report. We share the pain of the rest of the community. We're praying for, we're thinking about, putting others before ourselves. Clarifying facts, who, what, when, where, why, how. Everybody always wants to know how. When you call someone up and say, Aunt Gloria died, the first question is how. People need to be able to process why things happened. Don't withhold the how part from people. The church burned down. Where? What's gone? How did it happen? People need those answers. So what do we know? And I would throw into that, what do we don't know? What's the process for getting more information to share? I didn't eat enough chocolate this afternoon. A statement of commitment, right? When are we going to do something next? In an hour, 2 hours, 6 hours, tomorrow morning? And what are we doing that's positive? If there's been a fire in a house of worship, saying, you know, we've contacted the insurance company, we have let the diocese know, we have hired a cleanup company, they're going to be here this afternoon, we've boarded up the church, we've found the Bible, we've saved the crucifix. Those kinds of things that make people feel like action has taken place, good things are happening. And then if you can, what other information can you share? And when's your next scheduled update? I love these little helpful hints up here about keep in mind, taking positive action, being honest, apply your risk communication principles whenever possible. Make sure you're being clear. Always great to check with people after you've communicated to say, like, was I clear? Like, did I get everything out there? And then you want to avoid acronyms. You know, we talked to ATF. That's great. Well, how many people even know what ATF is? So avoid judgmental phrases. I would also say self-congratulatory phases, like, I warned the school principal that this was going to happen. You know, they suck, I'm smart. That's not the right message in a crisis. That's a conversation for behind closed doors. Chances are it's not going to be well received there either. Humor is important, but humor only when it's appropriate. There's nothing funny about somebody getting hurt, somebody getting killed, loss of life, loss of property. Humor can be appropriate, but one needs to be careful. And avoid extreme speculation. It's extremely speculative to assume that someone has insurance. I would also say that it's extremely speculative to assume that loss is always negative. This has happened more than once to our chaplains, where someone says, you know, my husband was killed in the fire, and the chaplain says, I'm sorry for your loss. And the person says, I'm not, right? He's been beating me for years, right? This is liberation. We always have to check out our assumptions, and assuming we know what other people are feeling. Always better to ask, how do you feel about that, than assume that you know how they feel about that. Is it most likely someone is upset because of a death in their family? Of course, but it's not always the case. All right, this is another worksheet, again, to help guide you through writing a plan. The functional needs, incident consideration. So employee self-assessment forms describing the location of individuals, describing procedure, describing protocol and resources. These are the functional needs and the physical limitations of those needs. And these are the functional communication needs. There'd be also functional educational needs, functional development needs, functional administrative needs. So we have to discuss what those functions are and what are the limits of those functions, and then decide what we can do about them. Where do we need to change? Where can we change? And where can't we change? Woo. Okay, so last night there was a fire in your house of worship. Cause unknown. Again, you don't know everything. Sometimes it takes weeks to figure out the cause of a fire. FDNY is investigating. Office space and records were untouched. There's some damage to religious objects in the worship space. The worship space was to be used in 48 hours for a routine service and in 7 hours for a funeral. Leadership is actively seeking alternate locations for the funeral and will announce it quickly. It is not safe to be near the structure at this time due to air quality. That's a pretty comprehensive message. It's only 3 sentences, but it's packing in everything that someone's likely to ask, and it's confidence inspiring. You read this and you think, wow, the leadership has really thought this through. They've made plans. They're communicating with people. They're already working on backup. If you were to can't speak properly. If you were to compose an email for your congregation members to give facts and updates, what would you include? This is one way of doing it, but how would you do that? And again, we're not going to do a writing exercise virtually today, but I want you to think that through. Okay. Everybody want to power through or take another 5-minute break? I'm going to assume power through unless someone says they need a little break. Okay, onward and upward. Human resources, module 3. What human resources plans does your congregation have for all of these essential functions? And I simply want to add to it, it is not uncommon for staff and clergy after crisis events to feel like everyone was looking to them for help and that they got none. So it's always important to make sure leadership is supported during times of crisis and not just that they're expected to support others. Keep in mind that you need to recognize and remain sensitive to staff and volunteers and their personal needs during any incident. They're equally affected by the incident as everyone else in the community. Maximize the contributions of staff and volunteers, whether it's in providing essential operations or resuming full service. You want to take advantage of all the skill and experience and relationships that your staff have to get you back up and running again. Remember that your first obligation is always to your home life, your family, and life considerations. Nobody's going to function well at work if they're completely distracted by their family being in crisis. A human resources plan also explains the expectations, roles, and responsibility of staff, which we've already covered quite a bit. It maintains an order of succession, which we've also discussed, and then it ensures sustainability of essential programs or activities. And it allows staff to use their skills for the betterment of the whole community. TTE. Everyone in emergency management loves an acronym. Test, trace, train, and exercise. I will simply say this: when you write your plan, it's just a plan. You actually have to test whether the plan will work and train people to make sure it does work. And then you need to exercise the plan. You need to practice the plan. And you need to do that at least once a year, and we recommend twice a year. Depending on the complexity of your institution, the risk and the number of people involved and the turnover rate more often sometimes may be necessary. So you need to know plans and procedures, just training and exercising, evaluate the test. We call this a hot wash, so that you can make recommendations on how to make the plan better. And then you edit the plan. And that's a cycle that you need to repeat. Considerations: decide on how often and to what extent your congregation will test your COOP plan. I worked in parishes, congregations, earlier in my career for 8 years. In the 8 years, I was a chaplain and working in a parish. I can remember only one sanctuary fire drill where during the middle of a service, not at the end of the service when it was convenient, but during the middle of a service, someone yelled, "Fire, fire, fire, evacuate the sanctuary," and watched the chaos pursue. Trying to evacuate a worship space, particularly when it's full, and remember, all fire evacuations are supposed to happen within 3 minutes. You get everybody out within 3 minutes. It didn't go well. It didn't go well. We had parents run off to the church school, which they're not supposed to do because the teachers are evacuating the students at the same time. We had elderly people get bumped and walked over and clogging ways to get out. Ushers who were closest to the doors leaving before everybody else got out when it's their job to usher people out. We had clergy evacuating the sanctuary before they got the young acolytes, the altar party off. So there were a lot of learnings in that evacuation. But again, in 8 years of parish ministry, one evacuation, not good. That needs to be done much more often. Understand the trainings will range in complexity. Testing plans and training plans are not an opportunity to show people how dumb they are. The whole purpose of a plan is to make it feel accessible, that it's clear, and that people feel empowered by it, not intimidated by it. Unfortunately, some people who test plans think there need to be trick questions and complicated questions. That is messing with people's heads, right? That's a power trip. The goal of testing a plan is to make sure it works and that you can improve it. So never let somebody who's likes to, think they're clever, test your plans. Make sure your exercises and trainings are specific to your vulnerabilities. Fire in a house of worship, active shooter in a house of worship, hurricane in a house of worship is a really dumb exercise. We know hurricanes are coming days in advance. There's never going to be a time when the congregation is gathered and has to evacuate the church because of a hurricane, not unless it's a shelter. So it's a fire, an active shooter, a emotionally disturbed person. That's why you're evacuating a sanctuary. Active shooter in a house of worship or active shooter in a nonprofit, that's something everybody needs to exercise. The reasons it's complicated is because it doesn't just involve the people on site, it involves the families of the people on site. So they're not easy things to exercise. Okay. This is a FEMA matrix for how we exercise. The first is seminars, just basically talking people through a plan. The second is workshopping the plan. So in essence, it's a training. The third is a tabletop exercise. And then we get into gameplay and drills. Those are far more likely in nonprofits. Functional exercises and full-scale exercises, that's the kind of thing where you are practicing the evacuation of a sanctuary for a fire and the fire department is on site. And ambulances are on site and police are on site and there's spectators and there's injured people. Like that's a full-scale exercise. Some fire departments, particularly in suburban communities, will do full-scale exercises with schools and nonprofit facilities, sometimes houses of worship. Most houses of worship are sticking in this range, maybe a drill. You have to have a lot of capability and skill to get to some of these things. Application of exercises. After the exercise, you always want to, there's no point in having an exercise if you're not going to hot wash the exercise, because then you're not learning anything from the exercise. So you always want to recap it, document what went right and what went wrong, and never let it be about only what you got wrong. Right? You always want to look for opportunities to congratulate people on what they got right, and then talk about what we could have done better. And if it really was flat out wrong, identifying that is okay, obviously. But the goal here is to improve, not to criticize. After an incident, you also want to do the same thing. An incident is like a full-scale exercise. You want to document what went right, what went wrong. You want to report out on what went wrong. You want to document what went wrong. And there are always opportunities to look for improvement. So every time NITIS holds a conference or a training, we talk about what went right and what went wrong so we can do it better the next time around. Reconstitution. Reconstitution is getting back online. It's about institutional resilience. You're activated for a crisis. you respond to the crisis, and then you get back to business. Reconstitution can be as simple as communicating that we're back online, right? After a snowstorm. It could be communicating that the mask mandate has been dropped. You can come back to church at full capacity. That's reconstitution. It can be that we're back to serving 100 meals a day instead of 50 because we have to be at half capacity. And it can also obviously be a lot more complicated than that. Sometimes reconstitution is actually rebuilding, and it can take years. But if you're going to rebuild a house of worship, you want to rebuild it better. You want to make sure that how it burned down can't happen again. How it flooded can't happen again. How a shooter entered can't happen again. Planning requires coordination to ensure a seamless transition back to normal. And what is normal? Because that's a relative word. You will need, if not, I would be surprised, to address spiritual, physical, and psychological impacts on staff and volunteers, recover records and files, and reacquire specialized ritual objects and materials potentially. Notify all personnel that the threat or actual emergency no longer exists. This is partially a communication outline. Provide instruction for the resumption of normal operations. So what do we expect people to do? Supervise that ordinary return. Report the status of relocation and reconstitution, and conduct an after-action review. Communities are best prepared for emergencies when everyone is prepared, not only emergency personnel. I just can't emphasize enough how everybody in the congregation needs to know what the plan is. They don't even have to agree, because it's not within their purview often to agree or disagree. They're just being critical. Nevertheless, preparedness is sharing responsibility. It calls for involvement of everyone, not just the government, not just the leadership of the congregation. Preparedness is a systemic challenge. The entire community needs to be prepared, not just people with expertise in certain areas. Okay. Let's apply the basic concepts of human resources, test and training, and reconstitution. I don't think these worksheets were sent. Is that correct, Lucy?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So this is an essential records tip sheet. We will send that to you. We want to identify the essential records functions of the essential services that you identified on the very first worksheet. So you need to take every component of the very first worksheet and break it down by what records are required for that essential function. Next, the vital systems that are related to each one of those essential functions. Could be gas, could be electricity, could be food. And then this is a human resources check sheet. So all the things that you need to be aware of, have a plan for, accommodate, related to these essential functions. Congregation, I'll just pick one of them. The congregation or organization ensures that staff is aware of and familiar with human resource guidance in order to continue essential functions during emergency. Staff need to know what the protocol is, right? They need to know what they're required to do as part of an essential function, or not do. Another one is accountability. A procedure is developed accounting for all personnel, during an incident. It's one of the reasons we don't let people self-deploy. It's not up to an individual to decide whether or not they're needed. It's up to leadership to decide. And when they self-deploy and leadership isn't aware, they put themselves and everyone else at risk. Being responsible for oneself and responsible to the plan and following rules that we know are in place are all critical to the human resources component. Next steps. Meet with the appropriate decision makers in your congregation or organization. Hopefully you'll have pre-identified stakeholders to help people think that through. When we say develop and write a plan, develop could also be substituted with outline. It's easier to start with something simple and build on it than it is to start with a detailed plan. They're very intimidating. They scare people. They turn people off. So it's always better to start with the outline and get buy-in for which essential functions people want to flesh out first. That's part psychology and part best practices. And test your COOP, as we've discussed within the congregation. Okay, we've covered a lot, and we couldn't do a lot of the in-person things that we often want to do. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? It was that good, that comprehensive.
Peter, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is my first COOP training too. Can you give an example of why, I guess maybe a nightmare example of why people can't self-deploy or just show up? It's hard for me to understand why that's so dangerous.
I mean, there's two types of self-deployment, right? Self-deployment to a facility, if you will, and self-deployment to a scene. So let's just say you hear a congregation burn down and you go to that scene. What's your function there? To be a spectator? To be a chaplain? Who needs you to be a chaplain? You think you need to be there because you're a chaplain? You were called because a chaplain is needed? Did the person who called you have the authority to say that a chaplain is needed? This is about functional coordination of the scene as much as it is respect for incident command, as much as it is checking yourself. Every time there's a disaster in this city, the recent Bronx fire, the Twin Parks Tower fire in the Bronx is the perfect example. There were so many people that showed up at the scene, it was hard to control the scene. There were so many people that showed up at the city service center and that were getting up in the business of families, but nobody ever asked whether or not they were needed, whether or not they have the skills to be there, whether or not the lead agency overseeing spiritual care, for instance, needed more volunteers. Self-deployment often is an expression of our individual need to be there and help, and not the need of the incident commander and the survivors that are at the scene. It often becomes about substituting your own judgment for the judgment of emergency managers. On a safety level, it's a little bit different. There were people killed on 9/11 because they saw the towers on fire and they went into the towers and nobody knew they were there. So nobody went to look for them and they died. And in some cases, people went to the towers because they were supposed to be there. And in other cases, they didn't. It took years to figure out whether or not some people who supposedly died really did die, where they were there. It's that level of complicated. Does that mean you shouldn't help people in a crisis? Of course not. You should always help people in a crisis, but someone needs to know where you are and what you're doing and that you're wanted. Technically, the World Trade Center terrorist attack was a law enforcement incident, right? It was a terrorism attack. Nobody should have been on scene that wasn't on scene because the police wanted them there. But it was a 16-acre scene. It was hard to control access. It's really quite simple, really. Are we there because we were asked to be there, because someone in command needed our skills? And are we there because someone's determined it's safe and they know we're there to help and we're wanted on site? Okay. You are going to get an evaluation from Lucy. Please fill it out. And in return, we will send you a copy of the slide deck for this presentation. And we will include, once again, copies of all of the worksheets that we use for this training. We will send you those worksheets in Word because we want you to be able to manipulate them for your own use. So if you use them and publish them somewhere, please credit the source, but feel free to edit them to make them applicable to your organization. Any final questions before we end our time together? Okay. Thank you so much for being with us. It's always great to do these COOP trainings because they're small groups and we get to have a little bit more time to make sure everybody's had an opportunity to speak and learn what the basics of COOP are. We have upcoming risk communication training and writing a risk communication plan, so feel free to join us for that. We also have an upcoming disaster chaplaincy training, which is a 3-day course. It's free for New York City clergy to take to be certified to do disaster chaplaincy here in New York City. There's 2 disaster chaplaincy agencies in New York City that are deployed by the Office of Emergency Management. That is the American Red Cross and NITIS. There are other chaplaincy groups in the city, but they are not part of the city's spiritual care response. We encourage you to take that course. There's a religious literacy and competency course coming up in June as well. And on March 29th, we have our annual Clergy Preparedness Summit, this year talking about equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the provision of disaster human services. So that is another training opportunity. And finally, our mental health first aid trainings are also available. So I hope you will sign up for any one of those if they're of interest. We appreciate your time today. And Lucy looks forward to being in touch with you. And please feel to call on her if you're looking for a different information or different resources. Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely evening.